Today starts a new project here on Locked On Pacers, the player season reviews, and who better to join us for those than Caitlin Cooper, the creator and writer at Basketball. She wrote tons of great insight on every player. And today we start with the reserve bigs. We'll dive into everything from 2022-23 for Isaiah Jackson, Daniel Theis, and Jalen Smith. It's all coming today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI. And today, so much to dive into, starting a new mini-series here on Locked On Pacers that'll last over the next couple weeks. Player season reviews. And who better to join us than Caitlin Cooper from Basketball. She wrote her Patreon page, formerly of Indy Cornrows. And we have a lot to dive into for every player. We'll talk about one key stat, one key play/clip, and one over-under going forward that will define the players past and future with the Pacers. Today, we start with the backup bigs. We get to Jalen Smith, Daniel Theis, and Isaiah Jackson. So much fun with Caitlin. Check out her work at patreon.com/basketball. She wrote by her merch. I'm wearing her shirt right this second. I highly recommend you check it out. I think you're going to really enjoy these next two episodes. We're doing another one tomorrow talking about Benedict Mathurin. It's a hoot. They're all great. And let's just get right to it today. The author of Basketball She Wrote and the creator of the shirt I'm wearing, Caitlin Cooper, here to start the Pacers player season reviews. We can call them that. We can call them the one like her and Mark Schindler did last year, because we are using a similar structure this year. Today, focusing on the Pacers swath of reserve big men, Isaiah Jackson, Jalen Smith, and Daniel Theis will get put under the microscope today. Caitlin, did you have fun digging into this group that had some rocky moments this season, let's say?
I did. I was thinking to myself while I was preparing for this the last few days that, do you remember the time when Brian Windhorst was on ESPN and the screen had him sliding across in the background?
Yes,
I was thinking that's how the two of us should be for this, because it was such a carousel rotation of these three people that it would fit as we go between the three people we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I could have made way more tongue-in-cheek comments about minutes and rotations and such. I'll only have one in my segment. The way we're going to do this for all these, everybody listening, is one stat, one clip that we can't show on YouTube, but you can find in patreon.com/basketball she wrote of this. I'll try to tweet them after Caitlin's post is up. And one over-under looking forward about the player for a stat or something. We'll start today with Jalen Smith, which was Caitlin's assignment. Caitlin, give me your one stat for Jalen Smith's season.
Oh, we're doing the one play first, Tony.
Oh, okay.
We're doing the one play first. So you have it. So you're going to be able to look at it. And like Tony said, if people want to follow along, I'll have all of this embedded over at Basketball She Wrote on Patreon. So I have titled this clip Shoot or Drive Decision. I'm taking us to the recent game against the Milwaukee Bucks, where he and TJ McConnell are playing pick and pop. TJ dribbles off the pick, and Jalen's at the top of the key, buddies to the left of him on the wing. And there's a little bit of hesitancy, as you can see, Tony, in whether he should shoot the ball or drive the ball. He ultimately ends up driving it, gets to the rim and gets nothing, doesn't end up making the shot, obviously. And Myers Leonard there is helping off of TJ McConnell in the corner after McConnell spaces. So overall, what do you think in that instance, or generally speaking with regards to Jalen, what is the better choice for him between shoot or drive with where he finished the season?
Ironically, for this clip too, there's Javon Carter is trying to decide between Buddy Hield and Jalen Smith when he catches. If he could have flipped it to the left, but he doesn't have that read in his arsenal yet. When I talked to Jalen Smith in Cleveland in April, right before the end of the season, when he was reflecting on his year, he said he can't make anything from three. He said it himself, and he said last year I can't cuss, but he said I dang near couldn't miss, right? And that was a big difference between last year's Jalen Smith and this year's, is that 3-point shot and what it opens up for him and allows him to do. And I think as the season kind of progressed this year, he lost confidence in that shot a tiny bit, and you can see it in this, that he's open. The closest defender is Javon Carter, who's my height, and Jalen Smith is much taller than my height. Then he opts to go towards the basket for a bucket. And he had space to do it. Like, there is a decent amount of space between Carter and whatever the low man is in the paint. There's a bunch of guys down there. But the fact that he didn't shoot, I think, is telling of how he felt like his season went from beyond the arc and the decisions he has to make then to then create something else, which wasn't actually there for him.
Yeah, exactly. And I like that you bring up Carter there, because there are times like the Bucks in all of the games against the Pacers, whether they popped Jalen or they popped Miles, they were stunting over from the weak side. So with Buddy there, like, my preference would be that that's a 45 cut and you stunt that cut so that you're pulling that guy with you so there's more space up top. Plus, it can kind of help your transition defense, where if that shot doesn't go, then Javon Carter can't leak out. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably what led to some of the hesitancy. But just to provide some context with the numbers, and this is not going to be my one number because I'm going to go in a different direction with that. But he shot 28% this year on catch and shoot threes. And then if you're looking at the drives, and I broke this down on Synergy, from spot up attempts where he put the ball on the floor, on twos, he was 12 of 32, which that's very low volume, but 37% getting to the rim. And part of the problem is too that for him, if he does see like a stunt or even, somewhat of a closeout, which he didn't see a lot of closeouts this year, but if he does, he doesn't have a real explosive first step, nor is he particularly shifty. So like what we're seeing there when Miles Leonard and Drew Holiday, neither one of them are going with TJ McConnell relocating, he doesn't really have the ability to shift and adjust at the rim particularly well. And you're not going to do necessarily a methodical back down when you have that much space. But something that I do or would like to see more of from him, which he did a few times against the Hornets there late in the season, and some of the minutes when he and Isaiah Jackson were on the floor together, is to go to more of a Barkley drive, especially when he has smaller defenders on him. I think that's going to be a more effective method for him than the straight up like pop and drive or attacking a closeout, because he's just not bursty enough to maintain the advantage and do anything there. So that was mainly why I wanted to pick this clip, because I think it kind of summarizes where the two problems were for him offensively. And I like that you added the context to those quotes about, where some of his confidence was with his shot, because I know that you and I talked last year too, that he shot the three really well for like the first 7 games after he got traded, and then it kind of fell closer to his career mark. So that's why I had some hesitancy right away when they said that, they were going to put him at the starting power forward position and how exactly that was going to work. But if we don't have anything else to add there, would you like to know what the one number that I selected is?
I'll add a tiny thing, and that's
okay.
that he was playing the 4, obviously, and playing more minutes, so the per-game numbers aren't perfect. But first 41 games, 3.4 threes attempted per game. Last 41, he only took 2. Like, I think some confidence was a part of that. He took 6 or more threes 6 different times. They were all in the first 41 games. So even with the role change, I think he was just more hesitant as the season went on. But yes, your one number, please.
And that's good to add too, because I think some of it, like his field goal percentage went up because he was taking more shots nearer to the basket. So I actually think that was helpful for him. But my one number, I'm taking us to NBA shot charts formulation, since this is a thing that's, a kind of a team-wide issue for the Pacers. I believe they finished 30th in opponent offensive rebounding rate. So if you go over there, you can look at their regularized adjusted rebound rate, and it ranks all players by their position via big. So I've filtered this for Daniel Theis, Jalen Smith, Isaiah Jackson, and Miles Turner. And I'm going to have you take a guess, Tony. Of those 4, who do you think has the greatest impact on the defensive glass in terms of not necessarily them grabbing the rebound, but the team grabbing the rebound when they're out on the floor?
My argument for Turner historically has been he's not the best at going up and getting it, but he's kind of good at clearing other guys out. So him, Tyson Smith stand out as my gut number ones, but that's 3 of the 4 players, so I don't know if that actually counts. I would go Turner 1, Smith 2, Theis 3, Jackson 4 if I had to rank the 4.
Okay, so this is actually pretty interesting this season. So Jalen Smith is the only one who finished in the positive, and he's very slightly positive. He ranked 128th among bigs in this category. Daniel Theis minus 0.28, 388th. Isaiah Jackson minus 0.36, 408th. And Miles Turner minus 5.7, 466th.
Wow.
So, there's other things that go into rebounding as well. But one particular play, and this isn't my one clip. I'm not cheating here. I just want to bring up the moment that, he had probably one of his best games. I think we would both agree, against the Thunder here late in the season when he had 15 rebounds. I think he had 10 defensive rebounds. And at the end of the game, all the focus kind of was on, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander getting that switch against Benedict Mathurin, and Benedict Mathurin staying on the ground through several pump fakes, and then, using the weak hand contest and getting that stop. But there was still like 7 seconds left on the clock after that shot went up. And Jalen Smith was on the wing. Lou Dort crashed. He noticed that Lou Dort was crashing, actually got his body on the inside, boxed out, and then fought off Dort and I think one other Thunder player in order to secure that rebound. So that was a key play in getting that win. I don't know how everybody feels about the Pacers getting that particular win, but that contrasted quite a bit to if you go back to the Hawks game earlier in the year when all the starters were pretty much out and Isaiah Jackson was the starter and John Collins got that tip in. What people might have missed before John Collins got that tip in is the Pacers went and blitzed Trae Young, and Trae Young took what was kind of a bad shot super deep over Andrew and TJ McConnell. And Isaiah Jackson was guarding DeJounte Murray in the second half of that game. DeJounte Murray does the exact same thing that Lou Dort did to Jalen Smith, sneaks behind and goes and gets the first offensive rebound, puts the ball up, and then John Collins gets inside position on O'Shea Brissett. So I think that Jalen Smith has a pretty good impact on the defensive glass. Like, nobody on the team is an excellent rebounder, as we know. And if also, like, in addition to their rebounding, their first chance defense wasn't good. Like, if you look at PvP stats, I think they still ranked 25th in defensive rating, even on their first chance, if you take away the putbacks. But has Jalen talked to you at all about his rebounding, or has the team talked about the rebounding for any of the bigs?
I asked him about I can't remember when in the season this was, but he's one of the guys, like Terry Taylor always would say this too, where he talked about opponent tendencies. So I think when you look at that Dort play specifically, like the Thunder like to crash, right? So he knew, okay, someone could be behind me. Let me look. There he is. Okay, I stopped him. Like, that isn't easy to do when, especially for Isaiah Jackson, your whole life, you're the most athletic guy on the court. It's see ball, get ball. Whereas for Jalen Smith, it's more like, let's use technique and be strong and burlesque. And that's part of it. And also, like, every player ever has said the same thing with rebounding. It's an effort thing. You just gotta, and like it is, but there's more to it than that. Then Terry Taylor was an awesome rebounder at 6'5" for a reason. I've cited him twice in this quote, but Jalen is good at that sort of thing and knowing who's on the floor, what the other team's tendency is, and using that to get an advantage on the glass.
Yeah, I think that's all sound. I mean, rebounding is tough to measure too, because a lot of it has to do with your defensive system. What shots your defense tends to give up can impact ricochets and where they go.
And too, like for the Pacers who try to run, right? Like, you don't crash as much as other teams maybe on the defensive glass. And so your big usually does, but for them specifically, it can be different even more than other teams.
And the Pacers, I mean, the one thing there is, though, the Pacers run a lot off of makes. So, okay, so now we can shift to the one over under, which you can probably guess where I'm going to go with this, given what the clips were. I've pegged the over under at 34.9. Do you want to take a guess at what my 34.9 is, Tony?
Is it 3-point percentage?
Yeah, so just to add some context to why I picked 34.9 specifically, is I looked at what he shot on threes when he was defended by forwards this year, which was 29.9% when defended by forwards. When he was defended by centers, he shot 35.1%. So I think we can probably safely assume that unless something goes wrong, if he's still on the roster next year, he's going to be playing at the 5 position, not at the 4. So where would you project his 3-point percentage to be? Would you take the over or would you take the under?
I would probably take the under. I think we have a significant enough sample size outside of that 7 games that we've talked about before that he's probably closer to a 30% guy in his career, and he can get better like every player ever does when they're young, but I don't think there's quite enough for me to think that he'll just suddenly be a league average shooter for a full season next year. But he could get close to that, perhaps, especially if he is playing center all season. But at the same time, being guarded by centers will help and create more space. But if he is playing center more, he also won't be playing with Halliburton as much. Like, the creation value would be less. So I'll say under, but not too much. Maybe like 33 would be my number.
Yeah, I think I would take the under too, because I don't think it's going to be a massive outlier. But like, over the last 8 games, 89% of his attempts were uncontested. Like we
Wow.
think of fives and we call them stretch fives if they can shoot a three, but the reality is a lot of times nobody at the five spot, except for a very small handful of guys, are actually stretching the defense. But if you can knock down those shots, it's basically 3 points or free points, excuse me, because
It
guys
is
aren't
3
going to.
points.
Yeah, it is 3 points, but it's also free because guys a lot of times aren't going to come out there, with the exception like we saw some of those stunts against Milwaukee, but the rim protector doesn't take a lot of steps toward him, so. I think he made at least 1 3 in each of his last 6 games. And in the earlier stretch, too, when he was initially moved to backup 5, when Isaiah just kind of got bumped from the rotation and they were in that 8 of 10 game stretch, he made at least 1 3 in most of those wins. So that's not, correlation is causation. Like, oh, if Jalen Smith makes 1 3, the Pacers are going to win a game. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But it is helpful with the way that they play and how much of their actions are initiated 5 out if he's able to knock down some of those shots. So that's what kind of gives him a little bit of an edge at the backup 5 position, is because he can, at least theoretically, and is willing to step out and shoot, even though there is that hesitancy play. So I think that kind of summarizes what I wanted to be able to talk about with regards to Jalen. I'm sure we might flash back to him a little bit later when we're talking about Isaiah too, just to compare the two.
You just unintentionally highlighted my least favorite stat thing people do. And it's like, this is made up, but just like when it's like, when Torrey Craig shoots 50% or better, the Suns are 13-1. I'm like, what? When a role player makes shots, the team is better? That is crazy stuff. That is unbelievable.
You don't like it when we get arbitrary bellwethers put out there.
Yeah, I can't believe a team is better when shots go in. Hey guys, short little break here so I can talk to you about eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, Daniel Theis is next. This was my research project. All 7 games worth of clips, information, stats, lineups, whatever we have on Daniel Theis. We can start with the clip, but I don't want to start with the clip. Theis is an interesting player to me because a lot of my thesis of stuff I'll come back to here is he's really good at set stuff, like a certain action or play that the team could run over and over again, or he could be involved in. But the Pacers, per their own admission, do a lot of random stuff where what they do on a possession-to-possession basis isn't necessarily predetermined or a called thing. And I think that sometimes makes his fit a little clunky when he's out there, even though he does some stuff in terms of his screening ability and decision-making that is not necessarily replicatable by some other players on the roster. The one I'll go with is pace, actually. Pacers pace, that was hard to say. When Theis is in there, 99, almost 15 seconds per offensive possession when he's out there. When he's not out there, it's under 14 seconds per offensive possession. Pace goes up by 1.5 possessions per game. That isn't to say that that's wrong or worse, but I think for a team that's identity is predicated on the fast style, the randomness, the way that he kind of fits into patterns and plays a little slower. And he even said that, like, this team plays so fast, when I return, it's going to be hard. But that doesn't make him necessarily fit all the time as well as maybe some of these other bigs do.
Yeah, I think that's an astute point as far as the pacing, because he'll be 32 next season. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so he is a little bit older. And 2, I wonder how much of that also played into, I know War has talked about this, and I don't know if Daniel's touched on it, but he sat out most of the season. Like, we only saw him literally in the month of February. So where was his conditioning at in order to come to a team that's playing that up and down the floor? Not that he's necessarily like a rim running big anyways. I don't think that's probably what most people think of when they think of Daniel Theis. I will say sometimes I think that he probably makes better reads within like their Chicago action and other stuff than probably any of the other bigs on the roster, honestly. I think that he plays pretty well in flow game and his decision making and being able to pivot out of plays if they don't have something. Because one thing that did stand out to me in the first game, after I think it was the first game that Wara played in, Wara didn't know what he was supposed to do. They have they call it C. You'll always see him do this. The guy will come up out of the corner and they set a touch screen. He didn't know where he was supposed to go after that. And it was actually Daniel Theis who was telling him what the set was supposed to be and where they were supposed to. So, it is a set action, but a lot of the times what the Pacers run has so many different reads and options within it that he was actually giving some direction. So, I think that when they get into the half court, it can be fluid from getting from one action to the next because I think of what you're going to talk about here in a little bit. But I do question some of the pace thing if he were back on the team full time and if he was the solidified backup big.
Yeah, we'll get to his role as well. But even to apply this to the defensive end a little bit, this is kind of unrelated to the pace part, but more about the pattern recognition, whatever set stuff. Like when he knows when to rotate and to whom and what coverage to do, like I think he's really well positioned and is in the right spots, which is the same thing I just said twice. But when someone gets beat and he has to recover, he's not quite quick enough to cover for them, right? And that's part of his speed part of this as well. So while his defense was again solid at times, I think that kind of hindered what he could provide on a team that had a lot of blow-bys allowed, a lot of rotation issues that hurt him on the defensive end, and that kind of ties back to the same thing.
I think that's probably a good point to bring up too, because if you look throughout the season, especially with Isaiah and Miles, what were they doing with the two of them a lot of the time? It was Aaron Nesmith getting put on the 5,
Yep.
and Miles and Ijax getting assigned to low usage wings and being more in that roamer role so they could stay low for the very purpose you just brought up, because they were giving up so many blow-bys and they needed to have size around the rim all the time. They put them there. Now, Isaiah can cover a lot of ground. Can Daniel Theis cover that much ground if you have to? I think sometimes you probably, if you're going to be in that roamer role, you need to accept that's what we're willing to give up. We're willing to give up threes to that guy. So I think Isaiah sometimes his natural tendencies there kind of played against him, even though athletically it suits him. And it was kind of out of place for Miles a little bit at times, given that his role defensively since he's come into the league has more been swallowing up pick and rolls and playing at the traditional 5 spot. But I think your point there too, depending upon who they get at the 4 spot and how they set the defense next year, I don't really think Daniel Theis is somebody that you're going to assign to low usage wings and be using in that type of a setting. That's probably somebody you want at the traditional center spot and doing what you said, putting him in drop and making sure that he's smart with his angles and hoping that you can level people off that way. So yeah, I think that's a smart point.
Clip wise, these will be embedded, I believe, if you want to see them. The same 4 of his, I was wrong earlier, Kalen, off pre-recording, I said over half his assists. I was wrong. 4 of his 9 assists this season, we're talking about the smallest of small samples, came from the same sort of set where he would catch it at the top of the key immediately on the other side of the court, and it was different every time, which I thought was really interesting who the screener was. Someone would set a flare screen on the opposite side wing, and Theis would dribble towards them. That player could either back cut or come around that screen and take a handoff from Theis. And he, by passing to the screener or doing the handoff or hitting the back cut, got a lot of assists in that way, which, again, going back to something I said earlier, when it's like a set, these 3 players are doing something together, and he's setting a screen or has the ball to make a decision, sometimes he can do good stuff. None of his assists came in the short roll. I thought that was pretty interesting just to dive back. He did make some passes out of them. But that sort of thing is what I feel like he can do that isn't as common or doable by other Pacers bigs, even though he wasn't out there that much.
Yeah, this is really good. They really like using this particular action where what Tony described. It's a screen in the middle, a pin down in the corner for that guy. Sometimes teams call that Chicago. Sometimes they call it zoom. Sometimes they call it mash, where then you're going to get the handoff at the top of the key. So I like the 4 clips that Tony picked, and I'll try to put them all in the post so that you can see the differentiation of what reads Theis is making. Because when Tony says he's not sure if the other bigs on the roster could do this, there is a lot more nuance to handoffs than I think people always realize. I think sometimes we think, well, all they're doing is literally standing there and handing the ball off to somebody. You can sub anybody into that spot and do it. But in terms of, because how those are defended, being able to punish and under and deuce and over, there's actually some technique to this. So Tony's first clip comes against Utah, and Tyrese is setting the pin down on Kelly Olynyk with Aaron Nesmith zooming out of the corner. And because Olynyk's, that's a good screen from Tyrese, he's trailing behind him. So what you want to do in that setting, which is what Theis does, is pitch the ball ahead, because Nesmith already has a lead. So that's going to make it a lot harder for Kelly Olynyk to be able to duck under and meet Nesmith on the side if that was a traditional DHO. So by pitching it ahead, all Nesmith has to do now is stop and shoot, and then Daniel actually adjusts and makes himself parallel to his own man so that Walker Kessler can't get out there and contest the three. So there's actually quite a bit of technique there. And then Nesmith knocks down the shot. And then Tony has in the next clip, it's against Boston. TJ McConnell's setting the screen for Duarte. And
while you did do this one, what a wild combo of three players to be involved in this action on this Boston one.
It is actually. It's. I mean, yeah. To see TJ McConnell as the pin down screener, I don't think we probably did see that very often. But and then part, as you can tell, it just turns into split action. So Duarte doesn't actually come back to the ball. TJ does. So now it's basically empty side pick and roll because Duarte's left and is relocating to the opposite corner. And now Boston switches it, and TJ attacks Robert Williams and hits his little patented pull up two in the paint. Now we're against Sacramento, and it's O'Shea Brissett setting the pin down for Tyrese.
That one actually failed, and they still scored.
Yeah, and Kevin Huerter's top blocking Tyrese. So that means Tyrese has to back cut to the basket. So then Daniel just hands it right off to the pin down screener, which is O'Shea, who then knocks down the three, as Tony says. And now here we are at the last one. This is great because this is 4 different reads on 4 different assists. So now we're back against Utah, and Nesmith is setting the screen for Halliburton. And Halliburton's man ducks under the pick and under the handoff, which is what most teams will do, unless it's like a really elite guy, like you're talking about a Doug McDermott who can really swing out. Most teams are going to duck under a handoff because you're moving laterally. It's easier to beat that guy to their spot. So once they go under, Daniel Theis is about ready to rescreen, and that allows Halliburton to reject the screen and get and carve open an open lane to get right to the lane, and he hits it. So that's a good compilation package of clips because, like we just described and illustrated there, like that's different players involved in all of the actions, and he's having to make a different read. And I also think that meets my standard of being able to stand on my soapbox and say, yeah, there's actual advantage creation from DHOs that doesn't always get highlighted. So I like that you picked that.
Yes. Yeah. And that kind of stands out to what we talked about already, where it's like, if they're going to run, it's harder for him to be out there all the time. But if they're going to play like that, there is a role for him that works with the players that they have that makes sense. He can make the reads, he can make the plays, and it did work. I get why they turned away from him, but like that is a unique thing for their bigs on this roster. Turner's gotten better at swinging it at the top and getting involved in that kind of stuff, but Theis was uniquely special, especially because to me, his decision-making in those sets and his screening are his best 2 offensive NBA skills, really shined through in that kind of setting.
Yeah, and I agree because Isaiah Jackson has some passing flashes here and there, but he doesn't always protect the ball very well in those settings when he gets up top, and he's not as good at changing directions because in none of those, it didn't fully get denied. Theis didn't have to, but he can change directions at the top of the key and go to the other side if he needs to, whereas Isaiah a few times has had turnovers in those settings when he has to alternate from side to side.
Over under time, my tongue-in-cheek answer is 250 minutes. Which would be telling about what the Pacers decide to do with their backup rotation and that he's on the team next year, given that they have so many bigs in the rotation. I have a real answer, but that's my tongue-in-cheek one if you want to take a stab at it.
If whether he will have more, well, how many minutes did he have this year? 100?
160 something? That might be too low. Hang on. Lower than 250. Okay. 109.
109 minutes. It's just so tough to say because there's a lot to consider there because he is on an expiring deal. I don't know what his trade value would be like this summer when he didn't play. I mean, they talked a lot in exit interviews, as you know, because you were actually there, about that knee procedure that was very unique. And that was pretty fascinating that only that doctor in Iowa was able to perform that, and him saying that hopefully other, players will consider it for what was the issue? Was it patellar? Was it a patella tendon issue?
I can't remember.
I can't remember what he said, so don't quote that on me, YouTube listeners. So if they're wanting, like I said, if they're wanting to be competitive, if I'm being completely honest, I think that Daniel Theis is ahead of Jalen and Ijax at the current moment on probably both ends of the floor. But if it becomes a situation this summer, Kevin Pritchard likes to talk about their optionality and options and walking parallel and being able to keep all of that open basically till the very last second. If it became a case of, maybe even they trade some of the current picks for future picks because they don't like other trade options that are out there and they're seeing next year as kind of more of a continuation of this year and continuing to develop young guys, then I would vastly take the under if he's even on the roster. So I guess my gut inclination is to say the under, but I don't feel confident in it.
Yeah. it's just kind of reflective of the fact that there's 3 players in the mix for that spot. And it'll tell us a lot about the Pacers' direction that they've chosen, whatever that becomes over under next season. My actual basketball answer is sort of similar to your Smith one. It's 58%, 0.58, whatever. True shooting percentage, because if Theis can be effective on defense for the Pacers, that's one thing. Defense is fine on a team concept for him, right? We already talked about all that kind of stuff. His true shooting percentage this season was 0.497, 49.7%, 0.001 above Chris Duarte, who most viewed as having an atrociously inefficient season. And for his whole career, Theis has been way more efficient than this season, but within a new team and a new concept, it was way down. Obviously, he was recovering and getting his legs under him. If he could be a 58% true shooting guy, like that's an effective player on both ends, like you said, ahead of the other young bigs. If he's over that, he's solidly effective. If he's under that, it's kind of waffling to the point of them deciding which big to play. So my actual over-under would be 58% true shooting.
I think I want to take the over, and maybe that's being too optimistic, but I don't know how many field goal attempts he actually took. I mean, he was 2 of 11 from 3. I do know that off the top of my head. So it's not a very big number. And I do like some of the actions that they put him in that I think suit him pretty well, where, one thing they really like to do is they'll have one of their wings run off an exit screen to the corner while the other guy at the top of the key sets a flare screen for Buddy, and that's an intentional flare re-screen where Buddy then comes back to the ball and that draws 2 to the ball, and then it just becomes empty side pick and roll, which becomes pretty easy for a guy like Theis to be able to score on. They ran that a couple times for him, but it wasn't super frequent. So I do think that he slots into some things. I mean, and I think he can play with TJ or Tyrese or Andrew for the most part. So I think I'm probably too optimistic, but I'm going to take the over.
It's really close. His shot diet, in terms of the feet away from the basket, the lazy way of looking at it on Basketball Reference, is similar to what it was in terms of the number of shots within 10 feet in his 2 best efficiency seasons, right? Like, they are capable of getting him shots from his best spots, but if he can't hit threes, like, it's going to look bad. So I am inclined to say over as well if he gets the same shot diet on a much bigger volume. But again, it's a new system. It's a kind of a different style when he's out there compared to the rest of the team. Maybe it would be slightly under, but if it's above 55, I still think that's a significant change from what happened this year, even though it was only 7 games.
Yeah, one of the disconnect things that I noticed quickly when I was scanning over this morning was that Chris Duarte had a play where he drove from the wing, and you know how he likes to throw like those leaning lob passes. Theis, there wasn't a recognition that, like, oh, this isn't the other bigs that we have on the roster. So Duarte throws that up there, and Theis doesn't crash to go get it. So it becomes like this really long arcing lob to him for a 13-foot jump shot on the baseline. So, like, I think that's just part of the disconnect that they'd probably have to overcome a little bit because people weren't used to that on either side. But yeah, I like what you pointed out.
It's harder with him for stats too, because he played 7 games. Like, no matter what you pick or base it off of, it's like an astronomically small sample anyway.
I think that we should go look at lineup data about Theis and filter it for only.
Yeah, that might have. Yeah, but then they're talking about like 5 minutes of.
Yeah, exactly, and that would be very telling. And I'm not going to look at what the 3-point variance was during that time either, because
I was actually surprised at the Pacers shot like 41% from 3 when he was in the game. So I was like, I'm throwing out all just general offensive rating stuff because that's insane. Isaiah Jackson time, Caitlin Cooper. I wrote him down alphabetically. That's wrong. Isaiah Jackson time. What do you have for me, starting with Isaiah Jackson?
Okay, so I knew for a long time that I wanted to use this clip. I mentioned it briefly on my now defunct podcast several months ago, so maybe I shouldn't bring it up again. I don't want to sink your podcast too, Tony. But anyways, I feel like this clip epitomizes the entire Isaiah Jackson experience. So Andrew Nembhard gets a steal at the other end of the floor against the Atlanta Hawks in the game that Isaiah Jackson started. I believe this game was in January. And what people are going to see when they watch it is he runs out ahead of everybody, and that sucks in the defense. So Buddy gets the ball on the right wing. They like to play early and opposite in transition. Buddy takes a 1-dribble pull-up and misses. And Isaiah crashes the glass and snatches the offensive rebound, which his offensive rebounding numbers tore down the stretch of the season. Well, he and Jalen, to a degree, were pretty insane. Like that game against Charlotte when he had 7 offensive rebounds. So he gets the rebound, and literally right beside him is Chris Duarte in the corner wide open with his hands up, ready to receive a pass on a kick out, which those are really good shots when you can get a 3 off of an offensive rebound. But Isaiah doesn't even look over there. But then out of nowhere, he whips out this pass where he throws it between two defenders like he's throwing a football through a tire swing and throws it right in Buddy's shooting pocket to be able to attack off the dribble and then find Mathern under the basket. So I feel like that's how I felt a lot of the year watching Isaiah Jackson, where like he has these athletic feats and he has these really tantalizing flashes that make you be interested in seeing more. But at the same time, something that I use to describe him is he can kind of overcomplicate the simple at times. Like the simple play there is just throw it to Chris Duarte, who's calling for the ball right beside you. But instead, he whips it out and throws it over there. So I think that can also even apply to some of his finishing, which we might be able to dive into a little bit. But like, he shot 43% on layups this year as a big around the basket. And that's not because he has stone hands. Like, he has good dexterity and can manipulate around the basket. But for being a right-handed shooter, he really wants to get back to his left a lot of the time. Like another play I almost picked when they were in Portland, he had a very easy drop step that he could finish with his right hand. And instead of doing that, he pivoted it around into the defense to a hook shot with his left. And when you watch him, he wants to get to lefty finishes if he takes a dribble under the basket for a reverse where like he doesn't necessarily feel the defense and he overcomplicates what he needs to do on the floor, especially factoring in his athleticism. But that's some side tangents. What overall do you think of my clip there since I sent it to you?
It's interesting too, when you were describing it, I watched it a bunch. Like when he's getting the rebound, he's facing the side that Buddy Hield is on. So beyond not making the simple play, I wonder if it's just like he gets locked in. The Aaron Holiday had this problem as a rookie too. He gets locked in on what he wants to do and then can't pivot out of it once he starts doing that thing. So we saw Buddy Hield and he said, I want to pass over there if I get the rebound, and can't realize that this guy with no one within 15 feet of him is right there, right in front of his eyes as he turns and can't do it. Like when Aaron Holiday would drive as a rookie, I always felt like he had no plan, right? If he got cut off, he just threw something up or turned it over a lot, which was, I don't know what the right word is to describe it, but that's kind of what that feels like to me is, yes, overcomplicating the simple. The read is right there, but I want to make the pass that I already saw, which is across the court and through 4 defenders, and he nailed it to his credit. But yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And it was interesting, like this is only tangentially related, but at one point this season, kind of late, like in March, I was looking at what I thought, Isaiah Jackson's kind of exploring a little bit. Like he had a hook shot in one game and did some, like took an off the dribble jumper. And a lot of his stats of like the stuff I think he's good at are like exactly the same from year 1 to year 2. But the complicated stuff that he's working on, they were much worse. So is that like he's working on stuff and it's not working, or what's the deal there? So I think that the stuff he's good at and the simple stuff to him he can do, but once he kind of has to expand his game and explore a little bit, he does what you just described, where he overthinks it and isn't just playing naturally, I feel like.
Yeah, because he did have some 2 dribble moves against the Bucks when they were in town when Brook Lopez was in drop, and I think that might speak to it a little bit too. Because, I mean, I'm telling people if they watch him at the top of the key out of delay, if he's going to put the ball downhill and turn it, he's almost always going to put the ball downhill with his left, even if the coverage doesn't dictate for him to put it on the floor with his left. But if you look at the games that they played down the stretch when he, I shouldn't say struggled, but didn't finish well. It was against that last game against the Knicks with Mitchell Robinson in drop, with Brook Lopez in drop, with the Cavs bigs in drop. I think I have the number here, was 6 of 21. So, like, yeah, you want him to be able to attack, but also he's undersized. So he almost needs to be able to develop that little shot within 3 to 10 feet. And that's something that Theis kind of can do, where he can roll and stop the roll in the paint in front of the defense and be able to hit just not necessarily even a 3 like what we're talking about with Jalen, but just be able to hit a shot closer to the defense, and that will make everything easier for him. Because he is athletic and quick, if he can put the ball down on the floor once and maybe somebody comes a little bit closer to him, that'll make his finishing a lot better, because you definitely don't want a big shooting 43% on layups. Like, that's not too far off from when Aaron Holiday's finishing was poor for the Pacers. That's about where that was at. So I think that offensively, it's kind of what you said. Like, I don't know if you can point to a lot of things this year with him. I mean, I'll just ask you, like, a tangible in-season stride, like, that's new about him. Can you point to something specific?
I could see him trying to find ways to create his own shot a little bit inside of like 8 feet that weren't just dunking. Like you mentioned, the Brook Lopez against the Bucks, he had 2 or 3 buckets right in the first like 3 minutes of that game, where he just like one dribble shot it over Brook. Like that, you could tell he was trying that stuff, but it's hard to think of anything concrete that I'm like, right now he is way better at that than he was in October.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, because it's like you said, like he had a play against Mitchell Robinson in that Knicks game where he took a dribble, but it was a step back too. Like that's not a shot that you really want for Isaiah Jackson. But pivoting from the offense a bit, my one number, I actually ran this analytic myself, so I'm hoping I double checked it. It took me a little took me a little while,
Wow.
and there is some subjectivity here in terms of what some people might log these as, but the number is 58. He had 93 blocks total this season, which is a pretty absurd number given that he was only averaging, under 20 minutes per game. And I think he ranked like 11th in the NBA in blocks per game. Cleaning the glasses, his block percentage number, he's above the 90th percentile.
Yeah, insane.
Blocking a lot of shots, but 58, because that's the percentage of those 93 blocks that they came from help side. So instead of defending the primary action, 54 of the 93 blocks were in help side. So I guess just at first blush, what do you take away from that? That more of his blocks were as a help defender than they were defending the primary action or his own assignment.
So if he's in the pick and roll at all, that does not count in that 58%. Okay.
Yeah, that's not how I logged it. Yeah,
I would have done the same. So that's interesting because I talked about this a little bit after the Bulls game where Halliburton hit the game winner. Is during that game, I noticed a few times he got switched on to DeRozan, and he did a better job guarding DeMar than he would if he got stuck on Vucevic, right? And I think that's kind of part of his career defensive arc, is that he's better guarding perimeter players than big sometimes because of his strength and speed differences that he has. And so when it comes to what you just described, it's almost like putting him in the actions on a big is way less effective than just having him guard maybe not even a low usage guy, but just a lesser shooting player that he can stay in front of and help off of if he needs to under the basket, where that could be like a better role for him defensively. And remember when he came out of the draft, they thought, well, this guy can play 5 and 4, right? We saw it at Kentucky. And so maybe defensively he can do that. And that sort of suggests that maybe it does make more sense all the time he's in there to not have him on a big.
Yeah, and I think the number comes from, after watching it all, I think it comes from a number of places. So we have to remember what you said earlier, that they are giving up a lot of blow-by drives, which means he's going to be in rotation quite a bit.
Yep.
I've used this analogy before, and I like that Kevin Pritchard brought it up, that having a lot of blocks isn't always a good thing. It's kind of like, you want your mousetrap to work, but do you want to have a mousetrap? Not necessarily.
Wow.
I
love that.
I think you'd prefer not to all the time. So you don't always want Miles and Isaiah to have to be blocking shots. And sometimes Isaiah can have a really complicated relationship with restraint as well, where he kind of just wants to block everything. So yeah, his block numbers are really high, but what's he giving up on the possessions when he doesn't get the block? So since our preseason pod last year, as you will remember, and I wrote about this last week, kind of looking back at what takes I had on that podcast, I wanted to see him in the roamer role at the 4 spot, kind of like what Boston has done with Robert Williams. And the Pacers did that throughout the season in certain matchups. Sometimes they had to pivot, like in that one Hawks game when he was the starter. He started out on a Okongwu. He wasn't being able to stop the lob passes. His drop coverage just isn't quite there yet. He doesn't take the right angles. Sometimes when he switches out, he also has problems. So like a play that I would point out when he's a switch big, and I believe it was the very last game of the season, he switches out to Emmanuel quickly, and Emmanuel quickly backs it out to the 3-point line, as a lot of guards do, to drag him into space. And when he does that, Isaiah Jackson stands up. So he's now getting stood up, and he's not in proper guarding position anymore. So he thinks that it quickly is going to back cut him because he gets off the ball. He doesn't back cut him. He gets the ball back to shoot from 3, but Isaiah's already snapped his head like he's going to go get a back cut. It's like he's chasing a ghost. So in certain circumstances, he can either flip his hips too quickly against a switch, and then he's getting beat, and he's having to bank on his recovery speed and hoping he doesn't take a wrong step so he can backpedal, or he's getting stood up on the perimeter, and then when the guard beats him, he needs to be more disciplined on the finish, because it's like he needs a parachute and he'll jump on it. Like he's just very jumpy in a lot of these settings. So I feel like 2 years in that I don't know what the ideal pick and roll coverage for him is. I think hedge is probably best, where he can be proactive and really shuffle his feet, keep his back
And he
parallel to
can
the perimeter.
recover so well because he's so
Yeah.
fast.
And that's the thing. And like, because he can be aggressive and actually force a couple negative dribbles, that will lead to hang time passes and buys the other guys more time to potentially read those passing lanes. But then the Pacers, like, they don't have a lot of size on the back side of it. So if you do get that pass in there, then there's no rim protection. So what's best for Isaiah might not be best for the rest of the team. I do like it. I won't get too complicated. I do have a tweet out there. I like the idea of switch to peel, where you can switch, and then that would allow Isaiah to play closer to the ball. When you get beat, you peel on the penetration. So a guard fronting a big in that situation would peel off of the front, take the guard who's penetrating, and Isaiah would go back to the big who's switching. So that's another potential option. But to make a long, circuitous story shorter, in the games where they tried to put him at the 4 and have him in that roamer role, like, they did that. And if you just look at the last 2 games against the Knicks, they had him on Obi Toppin when he came in. They were letting him be the roamer, and sometimes it needs to be, if we've decided, we're going to be willing to live with Obi Toppin because he's not the frequent screener, then you have to live with it. And Obi, you got more than you bargained for from Obi Toppin in that game, but in part because it was like Isaiah's flat-footed and he's not ready in the play, and then he can't get out and contest, or he's helping at the nail when he doesn't really need to be, and then you're giving up a wide open 3, or certain reads like that where there's still reads involved that he's going to have to make even if he's in that role. And then, like, he also did it against Cleveland, where they assigned him to Jetty Osman when he was out there. And then the Cavs were just like, okay, well, we'll just use Jetty Osman and side screens. And now you're still in the screening action anyways. So I think in part, in order for it to work and cover up what some of his like closeouts can be, it would be helpful to see him out there with another big. And the minutes are positive when he's been out there with Jalen. But I don't know that, like, the idea of Isaiah Jackson in a roamer 4 role merits some of the roster imbalances they currently have to keep both of them on the roster. And then for whatever reason, like, they just must not like the look. I wanted to see more of potentially Isaiah out there with Miles, but that only got 13 minutes of action all year. I wrote about
12 in my head. It was low number, very low number.
Like, I wrote it. They did it against the Pelicans, and I wrote about it because I'm like, oh, maybe we'll get little windows of this every game, like maybe like 5-minute windows, and we'll get a peek at it. But they never went to it. My guess is because they knew if they did, that 5s are going to guard Isaiah Jackson, which puts Miles Turner back in his old role. So it's just, I feel like we're at 2 years, and like what you said, that you can't necessarily point to significant things that are different about his game from December to now. I think we're 2 years in, and I just don't know exactly what role he should have moving forward. So,
but watching him is cool.
yeah. I mean, it is, and that's why I like the clip that I picked, because he does stuff that literally makes you stop and have to be like, wow, or how did he do that, or that. He looks like a painting right now, like he belongs in a Michelangelo painting with the way that he's reaching out to the rim. But
I've tweeted some iteration of this like 10 times, but there's so many times where when he's in there, the offensive play is just like, oh, no one's on him, throw it up high, and they score. Like, it just works. But there are a lot, like, that's been his whole life. Whereas now that doesn't work over and over again, and you have to figure out angles and timing and other skills that make people guard you differently and all that sort of stuff. We have an over-under still to go here.
Yes, we do. So what I've picked for this, and this one is a lot, you're going to have to really do some projection here, Tony.
Oh boy.
I've picked 25, and that is the number of games this past season where he logged at least 18 minutes played. And you're probably going to think that's somewhat arbitrary, but I picked it because Miles Turner averages right around 30 minutes. So if you're looking at Isaiah as a center, the remaining minutes that would be available for him to play in any given game is 18. So do you think that next season he will play more or less games than 25 with at least 18 minutes played?
He can play for a little, I guess I would say over because of that, but I do not feel confident about it, especially because they have 2 other bigs in the mix already. But I don't feel, what do you know what his number was this year, to that exact question?
Yeah, it was 25.
Oh,
25 games.
Hey, there we go.
That's why I pegged it there. Like, do you think he'll play more than he did this year? More games next year of 18 minutes.
You would think in his third year he'd play more, but if there's none of that improvement stuff we've talked about, and they're going to try to be a playoff team, like, they might need more from that spot or whoever they're putting out there. My gut says over, but the more I've talked and let myself think, which is never a good idea, the more that I'm not confident about it.
Yeah, because I mean, there's also, like you just said, Theis and Jalen are still technically both on the roster. I have to think that by the time the season starts next year, that one of these centers isn't
No,
going to be
there's
on
no
the
way.
roster.
Absolutely no way.
But I surely did not think, though, Tony, that they were going to start last season with Goga, Jalen, Theis, Isaiah, and Miles all on the roster. So, and they made it through halfway through the year with 5 quote unquote centers. So there's that. I mean, I guess you could kind of ask, like, how healthy do you think Miles will be? Because if you think he's going to have a good season, he finished this season healthy, which I know he talked about was a big thing for him. If he's in the rotation regularly, then that would make it more difficult for him to get like break glass if emergency type minutes, or where he's either the starting or the backup. I guess how lucky do you think they're going to get in the draft? Because if they go, number one, then that's going to add another big to the mix. And then, how competitive do you think they will be as a team? Because this year they weren't as competitive, so Miles didn't play at the end of the year. That got Isaiah more games where he played more minutes. And then the other big thing that kind of hangs over Isaiah that we didn't actually talk about is the foul rate. And that limits how much he plays as well. So I think that he was still, I don't know what cleaning the glass has, but his percentile of foul rate at the big position is still, it was a little bit better than last year, but not much. And I did look up, because one thing that I don't think, we talk about how much he jumps and gets fouls, but part of something that he's really going to need to cut back on is the moving screens and the extracurriculars on the screens, because he's averaging 1.09 non-charge offensive fouls per 100 possessions, and that's the third worst mark in the NBA. The only two people who are worse this year was Nick Richards and Jonas Valanciunas. So that's one way where he could cut back on the fouling. Like, even if he's undersized, like, quit sticking your elbows out to make contact when you absolutely don't need to, because it's not even just like he's sticking out a hip. It's like he's literally being extra with it where he just doesn't need to be. So if you think he can correct some of the fouling, then that would help your what side of the line you're taking here too. So which did you say? Did you say you were taking the under or the over?
My gut was the over, so I said over, but I don't feel good about it the more we've talked.
I feel like I'm gonna take the under. Like, I think
Wow.
that, like, probably
There's good reason for it.
and I don't want this to sound harsh at all, because I actually think this works in his favor. Like, one of the most favorable things about Isaiah right now is that he is 21 and that the team does have him under control.
Yep.
So, that's, if you're looking for an edge right now, and like for me personally, I think Jalen's ahead of him, but you don't have Jalen under contract control for as long. You didn't draft him. He's on a rookie deal, and Isaiah is still very young. So there is opportunity for him to get better.
Didn't think Aaron Holiday, Nick Richards, or Valanciunas would come up today. So that was quite
but
the
they
segment.
did. We found a way.
And hey, yeah, look, we can dig into all these backup bigs all we want. If they win the lottery, au revoir, as they say in the land of Mr. Wembanyama.
That's a good pun, Tony.
I had to look up bye in French while you were talking. I can't say I remembered it from any moment in my life. Do you have anything else on these guys? Any parting thoughts on the backup bigs that they had so many of this season?
I guess I did look up quickly, and something that I didn't bring up is the last 8 games when Miles was no longer playing. I did want to see what the defensive rating looked like with both of them out there individually, and it was basically a negligible difference. They gave up 129.7 points per 100 with Jalen at the 5, and they gave up 128.9 with Isaiah at the 5, which is a really abhorrent number. And like, if I did look at who was starting, yeah, I did look at who was starting in which games, and the only game they won was with Jalen against the Thunder, and because I didn't count the last 2 because Jalen wasn't available. But I mean, they gave up over 140, and against the Hawks with Isaiah as the starter, against the Bucks with Isaiah as the starter, and against the Knicks with Isaiah as the starter. Like 3 times of giving up more than 140 points. So
intentionally fouling a 64% free throw shooter. Good idea in those games.
Honestly, that was sometimes some of their best defense at times last season. So yeah, I just wanted to bring up, there wasn't necessarily a clear leader in the clubhouse as far as what their defensive numbers were. And that's obviously not all on either of them. They have bigger issues to fix. But anyways, I think that closes out, unless you have something else to add.
My small parting thought would be just that I wonder if it, and I'm almost certain it did to some extent, how much, I guess is what I would say, how much it impacted them that their role just changed so much from week to week, month to month, game to game, even at times. And I get why they did it that way. Like, I think it was justifiable to alternate games for Jackson and Smith sometimes, try to show Theis his health and get him out there. And, Turner was having such a good year that you can't take him off the floor. Like, I get why they ended up doing what they did. It's just like Goga always would talk about how when he knew what his role would be, it was easier for him to prep and be ready. And maybe you could consider that a negative that he can't do that every game, but I think some of that's true for every player. And so when your role changes all the time and the guys you're with change all the time and the part of the season you're in changes all that, like that does certainly impact you in some way. And so the question I think for all these guys is how much, and that might be answered next year.
Yeah, and I kind of too question how much some of this was foreseeable, though. Like, they weren't playing Jalen at the 4 last year, and they didn't re-sign him, but they did sign him with the intention of playing him at the 4. And maybe in the back of their heads, they were like, we just really like Jalen. We think that there's more from him, and we want to see it regardless of if we end up moving him at the 5. But you effectively signed somebody to bury somebody that you had just drafted at the 5 position the year before, which kind of was making it a repeat of the Goga Patadze situation. And if you were thinking that you were doing it because you wanted to be more competitive, they had already traded for Daniel Theis at that point, and they didn't know that he was going to, I don't think they knew that he was going to have the knee issue because he played at Eurobasket for Germany and they won a bronze medal. So they had other options, and they kind of buried one of the people that they seemed like they thought pretty highly of going into the season. They talked about that in training camp. I'm sure you remember about how, in the preseason workouts, he was having all of these moments where they would stop and the gym would go silent and watch it, and that they were expecting him to have somewhat of a breakout year. So that did complicate things for everybody involved.
I can't believe it, but we're at what, like 6 Pacer seasons in a row now talking about center pairings and multiple centers. So
gotta love it. My favorite topic.
At least this time we're not picking sides. Tomorrow, it's Benedict Mathurin time. A full however many minutes on Mathurin season in the same exact style. This one is Caitlin's assignment too, which most of you would probably prefer. So we'll dive right into that on Friday's show. Caitlin, I guess you could do it yourself. I was going to say is on Twitter and tell everybody where, but where can people read about this stuff, follow you, get all your Pacers and NBA thoughts?
Right. So my Twitter handle is at C2_Cooper. If you go there, the link in my bio takes you to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/basketballshewrote. The post on this will go up shortly after Tony publishes the video. This video will be embedded so you can listen to us talk while you're watching the clips in the post. We'll have the numbers listed there. I do have a comment section. So if people want to put their picks for the over-under or write about how wrong I am and the things that I said, you're fully welcome to do that. And I'm happy to have you guys. I'm happy to be collaborating with Tony on this, and I hope everybody likes it.
Many more to come. We're going to do every player except for 2 vets who do not have enough footage to make this happen. So yeah, tomorrow it's Benedict Mathurin time. Thanks everybody. We'll see you soon.